Hey, what's up you guys? How you doing? My name is Kylie if this is your first time here, and today I'm doing something a little bit different. As you saw by the title, I am talking about the horror movies that I've been watching on HBO Max. Why this is different is because I've never talked about HBO Max before. I've done my top 25 horror movies on Netflix in the past. However, I just recently got HBO Max because my dad got it for the family. He wanted to watch Wonder Woman. What a shame that turned out to be. But I have had it for the past month, and so I've watched quite a bit of horror movies on there, and so today I'm going to talk about the ones that are a little bit off the radar, I think. This is going to be kind of just a bunch of mini reviews as well as just sort of a hit and miss list, because I want to start out the video just talking about all the horror movies that are on HBO Max if you just weren't aware of what was on there, so you can see if it's worth paying like $16 a month or something, because there is a lot of really good horror movies on there. So I'm just going to list off the good ones, and then I'm going to get into the ones that are a little bit more obscure that you may not have heard of. As always, before I start, I just want to shout out my Patreon really quickly. I do have some new content on there. This week I did an uncut reaction to Head Cheese, a very unknown short film that's somewhat part of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. So that's what's on there this week if you want to check it out. But without further ado, let's get into this list. I'm not going to talk about any of these because you just need to know that they are all movies that I love, that they're just all hits that are on HBO Max. They have all 4 of the Alien movies, and I would argue that only the first 2 are really worth seeing, but the third one is like, it's like okay. I don't really enjoy it though. 4th one is a bit of a train wreck, but they have the first 4 Alien movies on there, as well as I think a couple Predator movies. I know that they have like Alien vs Predator on there. They also have The Exorcist, which I am not a fan of, but I know that many other people are. I thought it was worth mentioning. They also have all 4 Jaws movies. They have both Gremlins movies. They have The Invisible Man from 2020, which made my top 10 list. They have the first 3 Scream movies, and I didn't see the 4th one on there. Could be, but I don't think that it is. They have Final Destination 5. They have Stephen King's Misery starring Kathy Bates. They have Seven, which is starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, which I haven't seen yet, but I have heard it's really good. They have Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of the It remakes. They have Us, one of Jordan Peele's best movies. They have a show called The Outsider, which I think I've mentioned briefly on my channel before. Phenomenal show. It's an adaptation of the Stephen King book The Outsider. I'm pretty sure they have all of the Conjuring movies, so they have both the Conjuring films, they have the Annabelle films, and they have the Curse of La Llorona. And finally, they have every single one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies except for Dream Warriors, which I know is a lot of people's favorites. But they have every other original movie with Robert Englund as well as the remake. Okay, so now that you know about all of the good stuff that's on there, I'm gonna get into the more obscure titles and the stuff that I've been exploring recently. By the way, this will all be spoiler free, just so you know. Up first is Blair Witch 2, The Book of Shadows, that came out in 2000. This movie only received a 14%, and if you're not familiar with what happens in this movie, here's the synopsis. A group of tourists arrive in Burkittsville, Maryland after seeing the Blair Witch Project to explore the mythology and phenomenon, only to come face to face with their own neurosis and possibly the witch herself. So I didn't quite make it through this movie. No, I did not. As far as I could tell, the characters were extremely unlikable. I was not having a good time with any of them. None of them were people that I would want to go out into the woods with and share a campfire with, and yet here we were, forced to be with these terrible people. I think I made it about 35 minutes into the movie, and granted, I did kind of like the opening where people were talking about the phenomenon of the Blair Witch Project from 1999. It was sort of meta in that way, and it made this movie feel a little bit more real, found footagey, because people were talking about the previous movie. However, that just devolved quite quickly when we were introduced to our main cast. The acting is awful. The characters are also pretty wildly stereotypical, and there's this one goth girl that just, she's not quite pulling it off because they wrote her so stereotypically, along with the way that she looks. And granted, it was literally 2000, so just the epitome of early 2000s, right? So characters were not the most well written in horror movies back then, and so that's somewhat forgiven, but I couldn't even enjoy it as kind of a goofy teen horror. And typically I am drawn to those because I love a good guilty pleasure dumb teen slasher type of vibe. Not this one. This one was such a letdown. It was such a huge step down from the original Blair Witch Project. And some people don't like the original because they claim that it's boring because you don't really see much. I would argue that's actually what makes the film so brilliant, because it is so understated. So with this one, there's a possibility that you would actually be a little bit more entertained if you found the first Blair Witch movie to be boring. However, you won't be entertained in such a way that you're like, wow, this is a great movie. movie. You'll be like, wow, this is a terrible movie. I personally wasn't entertained just because the movie, it didn't feel self-aware, and sometimes I like that. Sometimes I think it's really funny when a movie has no idea how bad it is. In this case, it was just so bad, and it was kind of just devoid of anything that I found to be funny, so that's why I didn't enjoy it. And the general consensus is that that sequel is really bad. Nobody really talks about it anymore because it didn't gain any notoriety. It's not a well-made movie. It's terribly acted. It's just not a good time. I might try to finish it, although I don't want to. Sorry, I have to text my boyfriend back because I sent him a picture of, well, this. Because one of my candles burned down way too low and I didn't realize that it would explode and collapse in on itself if I left it burning like that. You live and you learn. So anyways, my consensus on the Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows is that it is a miss. I don't think that it's worth your time. I don't think I'm ever gonna try to seek it out to complete my Blair Witch collection. I don't think I'm ever really gonna rewatch it or finish it. I'm perfectly happy just owning the original and the 2016 sequel that I actually did enjoy. So that being said, let us move on to the next movie. Up next is Deerskin. This came out in 2019, received an 87%, and this is, I believe, a French film. In Deerskin, a middle-aged drifter becomes obsessed with a fringed deerskin jacket that seems to hold mystical powers. So I'm gonna be real honest here. I didn't actually make it through this one either, and this movie is only about an hour and 17 minutes long or something like that. It's a very short movie, but yet it felt so much longer to me. And I know that it does get more exciting. It's more of a psychological thriller, and I know that some parts of it do get gory and things get more exciting, but I couldn't bring myself to make it to that part. I am gonna try to finish it. It's just that I was kind of just like bored out of my mind. I don't know what else to say. The dialogue was very strange and it all felt very disjointed. It had this kind of lack of humanity to it. And sometimes I like that. Like a good example of this is Vivarium, where that movie is completely stripped of humanity. Like it feels very weird. It feels like kind of an alternate reality. And that's what this movie felt like. And no, not because it's in French. I do like international films, but it was so hard to grasp what was going on. Like the plot was very convoluted and very confusing. You don't understand these characters' motivations, not a single one of them. And I'm usually all on board for very strange circumstances. I think it can produce very interesting and great movies, but in this case, it was just weird. It is rated really highly though at an 87%. I think that, I mean, maybe in a critical way, it was a pretty well-made film, and had I gotten through it, I might have gained a little bit more from it. But in my opinion, it wasn't worth getting through. I think the opening of it was so boring. It was dragging so much. I made it about halfway through the movie, and honestly, nothing had escalated at that point. And when the movie is only a little over an hour long, you would think that the pacing would be a little bit better, right? You'd think it would start to escalate maybe a little bit sooner. But I have a feeling that it's one of those psychological thrillers where it really only gets good at the very end. An example of that would be Hunter x Hunter, which was an excellent movie that came out in 2020, and that movie really only gets super exciting at the very end. But the buildup of it is still really good, and it's still really compelling. Whereas with this one, the buildup was just strange, and I wasn't into it. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, oh no, oh no. I just realized that I only made it through 2 of these movies in their entirety because most of the rest of these, I couldn't make it through them. I didn't like them. So I'm gonna talk about all of those first, and then I will talk about the good ones because there are some good ones. So up next is a movie called The Children. This came out in 2008. It received a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes, and here's the synopsis. 2 families gather at an upstate English estate in late December. Elaine and her sister Chloe, along with their husbands and children, are set for a weekend of family bonding and winter fun. But when they arrive, one of the children becomes sick and all the other children exhibit strange behavior. The adults don't realize the disturbing truth until it's too late. The children have contracted a disease that turns them into brutal psychotic killers. So with that synopsis, that's kind of just the entirety of this movie. I did actually make it about an hour into this film, so I definitely did a lot better than with the other ones. And this movie, it had some moments that were a little bit tense. There was a little bit of suspense that was brewed. However, I will say that for the payoff, there was some good gore. There were some moments of body horror that really were effective. But overall, I think that this is kind of a prime example of the cheesiness that the early 2000s in horror contains. The acting was really bad. It didn't sell me on it. The children in the movie were quite annoying. They spend a good amount of their screen screen time just screaming. So that's a lot of fun, especially if you're not the biggest fan of children. And it honestly just kind of wasn't believable, the situations that these adults would get themselves into with their children, and in order to get to a point where a child would actually kill one of the parents. It was very convoluted, and the way that it was shot, I think it was somewhat clever. Some of the shots did kind of work and sold these death scenes a little bit, but for the most part, it's generally just not really a well-made film. It's not super believable. It's really hard to suspend your disbelief. It's just hard to accept that in this movie there are 4 fully capable and able-bodied adults, and they are, you know, losing their lives to children. It's quite ridiculous. The premise of it just really interested me, and it kind of did hook me in the beginning. I am interested to kind of see how it ends, but I wasn't into the characters. There wasn't a single person in the movie that I was rooting for, because all the characters were just a little bit terrible in their own ways, and that includes the children, so I just don't really see there being a redemption arc. And I think that's kind of the main thing, is like, if a movie doesn't have a single character that I can latch onto and root for, I usually don't finish it, and that's kind of just been the case for these past 3 movies that I've talked about here. So I think had the movie had more interesting and likable characters, I actually would have been quite compelled to finish it, but as is, it's just not worth it because of the added factor that it's, you know, terribly made and not well acted and all that stuff. So The Children is a miss for me, and I don't really recommend it, although I do think it is kind of a unique premise, especially if you feel like you've seen everything else that I've mentioned, all the good movies on this list. It might be worth checking out. I just personally can't really get through movies where I don't like a single character, so that might just be me. Up next, definitively the worst movie that I'm going to talk about today, and that would have to be Birds of Prey, that came out last year in 2020. The Rotten Tomatoes score of this movie honestly had to have just come about via bribery and just paying critics to write positive things, because this movie received a 78%. It's open season on Harley Quinn when her explosive breakup with the Joker puts a big fat target on her back. Unprotected and on the run, Quinn faces the wrath of narcissistic crime boss Black Mask, his right-hand man Victor Zaz, I don't know, and every other thug in the city. But things soon even out for Harley when she becomes unexpected allies with 3 deadly women: Huntress, Black Canary, and Renee Montoya. Okay, so a lot of problems with this movie. One of my main problems with this movie is that it was kind of sold to us, especially from Margot Robbie herself when she was doing promotion from it. It was sold kind of as a feminine empowerment movie, and I just, honestly, when I was watching it, I could not believe that women wrote it. I couldn't believe that this was supposed to be sort of like a positive redemption arc for Harley Quinn in terms of her getting her freedom and her discovering her individuality and stuff, just because the story was so convoluted, and sort of some of the plot points that took us there were just like really questionable. There's so much wrong with this movie that I'm struggling to choose where to begin. So the opening of the movie, it starts with some narration, and then it turns out that the whole rest of the movie also has narration. So it feels extremely Deadpool-esque. This movie feels like very much just a copying of Deadpool. It's a movie where sort of an anti-hero goes through a redemption arc, learns something about themselves, learns about love, whatever. So that's one thing, copying Deadpool. Second, our villain is played by Ewan McGregor, and this man could not be a believable villain to save his life. I hate to say it, but I just think that Ewan McGregor is one of those actors that you have to typecast for like feel-good roles or like the good man role. He does not pull off the villain, and it's simply because this man is too sweet, he is too soft looking. He doesn't pull off those really sharp and kind of harsh lines of dialogue that villains kind of need to be able to deliver. I don't buy it when he's standing there and he has this henchman that's like cutting off people's faces. I didn't buy it. I don't buy it. So bad narration, bad villain. The next thing is that this movie is one of the most disjointed pieces of work I have ever seen. It has an extremely non-linear structure, which usually I think that that's fine. I think typically when a movie uses this, it's to serve a very artistic vision, and it's oftentimes to provide context when it's needed and stuff like that. With Birds of Prey, it was the most unnecessarily out of order movie that I've ever seen. It served positively no function. In Deadpool, he would use it in moments to provide exposition and to explain how he got himself in the current moment. I think they were kind of trying to mirror that with Birds of Prey, but it did not work, because tell me why we were about 40 minutes into the film and we were still being introduced to our main characters. No excuse for that. absolutely no excuse for that. And it's truly a testament to how horrible that editing is when you have Harley Quinn narrating the whole thing and basically just like giving us the plot, being like, here you go, here's what's happening, and yet it still did not make sense. I wrote a really scathing review of it on Letterboxd, by the way. If you want to follow me on Letterboxd, I'll be linked down below, as well as all my other social media, by the way. And lastly, there are a million other things I could list about how bad this movie is, but the last thing I want to mention is just Harley Quinn's accent.
Mr. J, my Joker. I only had eyes for pudding.
Nope. It seems to be trying to mimic kind of a Brooklyn accent, and I didn't notice it being that bad in Suicide Squad, and now I want to rewatch that movie because I'm very confused. It seems like she ramped up her accent by like 10,000% for this movie. I just spit. And I don't know if it's because she's Australian and it's just really hard to get the cadence of a Brooklyn accent just right, I don't know. But it was so bad and we had to listen to it so much because, like I said, so much of this movie was narrated. And narration in and of itself is also just really lazy writing because it kind of just proves that they couldn't provide the necessary exposition. They couldn't show and not tell, you know what I mean? They had to tell us, you know, they had to spoon feed us because of how convoluted and awful their plot was. Okay, so this video is meant to be movies that I've watched on HBO Max. It's not meant to be a rant about Birds of Prey, but there's that. Last thing though, because I talked about this movie on my hits and misses of 2020 and I was like, hey, you guys, should I watch that movie? I've heard it's really bad. And a couple people commented that it was actually a good movie, and I don't think my subscribers have ever led me so far astray. That's not to say that if you gained something from it, that's wrong. I'm glad that you did. I'm glad some people did enjoy this movie. But for me personally, that's time in my life that I will never get back. My boyfriend and I have kind of been watching it in increments, just trying to finish it. But I don't know if I can do it. It's just, I don't think it's worth it. It's such a long movie too. It's over 2 hours long, and for what? Anyways, time to move on to one of the better movies on this list. So up next is Open Water. This came out in 2003 and it received a 71% on Rotten Tomatoes. Daniel and Susan embark on a tropical vacation with their scuba diving certifications in tow. During a group dive, the two separate themselves from the others to dive a little deeper. An incorrect head count suggests the entire group has returned, so the boat departs. When the pair surfaces, they make out a vessel in the distance, but it does not immediately set in that they have been left behind. With sharks lurking beneath, their survival chances grow smaller. So as you just saw by that snippet of the trailer there, if you like extreme close-ups that look like they're shot on an iPhone 4, then boy is this the movie for you. In all seriousness though, this movie does work. I actually think it was really effective and I did enjoy it. I actually didn't find it to be very cheesy, and sure, the acting is not phenomenal because these aren't well-known actors. They really just feel like real people. So that being said, this movie actually feels a lot more realistic, and actually the grainy quality of the cinematography is something that, while annoying at first, you definitely get used to it, and it makes the movie feel a lot more realistic. I got used to the style of the cinematography very quickly actually, and that's really surprising because I'm pretty picky about the quality of my movies. But there was actually a really good amount of tension in this movie. It was very suspenseful. It was somewhat of a slow burn, but it's also a very short movie. I think it's about an hour and 20 minutes, and so the pacing is actually pretty good. It's also quite understated. There's a lot that happens that you don't really see, but it's kind of implied. So that brings in kind of a new level to those scares because it brings your imagination into it, which makes things a lot scarier than they really are. I believe it's also supposed to be based on a true story, so that makes it a little bit scarier as well. I think what works for it really is just its simplicity. It's a situation that feels very real because these just feel like regular real people. They're not well-known actors and you're kind of just thrust into this situation with them, and it feels very bleak. It feels pretty hopeless. And the moments with the sharks were surprisingly effective. It's not a very cheesy movie despite what you would think based on the quality of it. I think it definitely earned its 71% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think that's actually a very fair score. So it was a movie that I found to be pretty good, and it's one that I actually think I might revisit at some point. Hi, excuse me, hi, it's Kylie from the future. I know I did this in my video on Wednesday too, but I had to pop in again today. But I had to pop in because I watched another movie on HBO Max that I wanted to talk about, and it's actually the sequel to Open Water 2 Adrift. 6 longtime friends try to stay afloat in the ocean after they forget to lower the ladder from a luxury yacht. So I wanted to talk about this movie because initially I had started watching it and I made it about 8 minutes in and I decided that I hated it and I turned it off. And then I realized, wait, I really like horror movies that take place out at sea, so I'll try it again. Started watching it, made it about 2 more minutes in, and I was like, wow, I really hate these characters. characters, and that makes it really hard for me to follow along with the movie just because I don't root for them. I don't want to keep watching it. But I decided that instead of turning it off like I have done with so many others, I just skipped ahead like 20 minutes. So I skipped ahead to about 23 to 24 minutes into the movie, and that's when the first like inciting incident is, when they jump in the water and they realize they don't have their ladder. Uh-oh. So I just skipped ahead to there, and then that's when the characters stopped being annoying because they were in peril. And from that point on, I actually really enjoyed the movie, and it's not quite what you think it would be. It's definitely strange that it was marketed as a sequel. It's not really, because it doesn't follow any of the same characters, nor is it a similar situation to the first movie. Well, kind of. Okay. Both movies take place out in open water, out in the middle of the ocean, so that's a common theme. With this one, I really like the added element of the fact that most of them do not have life preservers on, and I like the fact that their savior, this giant boat, is literally right there, but they can't get onto it. Now, this one's definitely not as good as the first one, and it is a lot more frustrating because there are moments when they could totally save themselves and then they just like don't, because obviously the movie has to keep going. And some parts are really cheesy and they're trying to be very dramatic and emotional, but it just doesn't really work out. But other than that, I think this movie earned its like 44 or 46% on Rotten Tomatoes or whatever. I think that was actually a fair score. If I were to recommend it to you though, I would honestly recommend skipping ahead to like 23 minutes in when the actual action starts, because in the beginning the characters are just being really annoying. They're just kind of on the boat. It's a very hyper-sexual movie. Well, until they actually get into the water and they have to start fighting for their lives. Because that's when the acting actually gets good, and you would think it would kind of be the opposite, that the acting would be better when it's just like conversational and they're just hanging out with friends and stuff. But it's actually way easier to do very dramatic, emotional, like loud scenes rather than just having kind of common dialogue with people. It's actually really hard to make casually written dialogue sound natural. Because when you're with your friends and it's casual and you're just making jokes with one another, it's very off the top of your head. None of it sounds written, obviously. So when it's pre-written and you're delivering it to people that you probably don't even necessarily know, they're just like other actors and not really even your friends, it's very hard to be casual. And this movie definitely suffers from that, so I just recommend skipping ahead. Also, fair warning, the action in this movie is all pretty good. Like the plot, I like it, but the ending, the payoff is kind of minimal. Okay, that is all from me. Back to the other Kylie. So moving on to the last movie that I want to talk about today, and that is called Sound of My Voice. This came out in 2011. It received a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes, and here's a synopsis. California couple Peter and Lorna set out to make a documentary meant to expose a charismatic cult leader named Maggie as a fraud. Maggie claims to be from the year 2054 and is seemingly allergic to almost everything in her environment. She lives in a basement, subsisting on canned oxygen, homegrown food, and the blood of her acolytes. Though at first Peter and Lorna are adamant that Maggie is a fake, they both soon fall under her spell. This movie was very strange. This is one that definitely compelled me, and I made it through all the way with my eyes glued to the screen. It is hard to say if I would recommend this one. It is a psychological thriller. It's not really a horror movie, but it definitely gets under your skin. It is very uncomfortable and very strange. I think that's kind of a given because of the very strange synopsis that you just heard. It's a very interesting situation that these characters find themselves in. I loved the premise of it, but I think that honestly, I don't know if the ending is worth watching the entirety of the movie. No spoilers, don't worry. I just think that this movie had such a phenomenal build-up, and then the ending left me wanting so much more. Sometimes that can be a good thing because then it can leave you to kind of think about the movie for a long time afterwards, and in that way a movie can be really successful. However, I do wish I had gotten just like an ounce more, just like a little bit more closure than we got. There were also some things brought up that it seemed like they were going to provide closure with in the ending, and then they never did. So that was also really frustrating, but overall, I did find it to be a pretty good movie. I think the acting in it was especially really good because this definitely was a lower budget movie, but the acting really sold me. I was very surprised. Another thing I want to say is that the soundtrack to this movie was phenomenal. It was very understated and probably a little bit hard to miss, but I found it to be so haunting and honestly quite beautiful. I think the most I will say that this movie did probably achieve what it set out to do. It did impact me psychologically. I did feel very uncomfortable. I felt very, very confused. I left the movie thinking about it and the implications of it and what happened. I don't know. So this one, it's hard. It is kind of slow. So for my horror fans that are watching, I don't know that you would love this movie. I wouldn't even say that I loved it. I don't think it really has much rewatchability to it, but it is very interesting, and as a psychological thriller, I do think that it is successful. So I would say it was a hit for me, although I don't think that it really has rewatchability. Oh, and one more thing that I've watched recently that I want to mention because it is so good is the show called Miracle Workers. It stars Steve Buscemi, Daniel Radcliffe, Geraldine Viswanathan, and Karen Sony, and they are such a dynamite cast. This show is so much fun. The first season was phenomenal. It's a comedy set in the offices of Heaven Inc. When God plans to destroy the earth, two low-level angels must convince their boss to save humanity. They bet him they can pull off their most impossible miracle yet, help two humans fall in love. So that synopsis is just for the first season. It is an anthology comedy show, so the second season is set in the Dark Ages for some reason. So the second season is by no means as good as the first season, but the first season is so worth watching. It is so good. Daniel Radcliffe is so talented, it makes me lose my mind. He plays such an opposite character to Harry Potter in this show, and it's really funny to see, and he pulls it off perfectly well. And I just love that for him because he does have range. He's not just Harry Potter. He is so unbelievably talented, and he has the range to do all these different crazy wacky things. Steve Buscemi is also super weird, and he's really good in it too. And I'm a huge fan of Geraldine Viswanathan. She was also in the movie Blockers. Okay, but that does it for real. Sorry, I know that's not a horror movie, but I just had to mention it because it is a really good show, and I want you to be informed on like whether or not you should get HBO Max or not. Not telling you how to spend your money. I don't really think HBO Max is worth it. We're only keeping it for the next month because there's a couple other movies that my dad wanted to watch on it. There's not a whole lot on there that's worth it. For all the horror movies, like obviously it is, but those are all movies that if you're a horror fan, you've probably already seen. So it's not like you really need HBO Max, you know? But that is it. That does it for everything that I've been watching on HBO Max recently. I hope that you found that interesting. Like I mentioned, my social media is linked down below. My vlog channel is also linked down below, as well as my Patreon. I hope that you join me next week when I start my Scream series as well as my Harry Potter series. I am so unbelievably excited to start talking about those franchises. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope I catch you in the next one. Bye!